Good evening. Our presentation tonight from Magus Center, the third module, is the philosophical proof of God's existence, which will complement our study last week on the existence of God from the physical sciences.
Lord, we thank you for our gift of reason. With this gift, we can logically arrive at truths about you and the universe you created. May our study lead us to know what is real and true, and so lead us to you. Amen.
This prayer, I really appreciate that um, the uh, the universe came forth from not a kind of energy force, or it came from a person who intended to bring the world into being, even though he didn't need to, he did. And because there's order within creation, there's order in creation because it comes from a mind that's all knowing, that's orderly. And that's why everything within the created order can be understood. We may not be able to know everything about creation, but anytime we inquire about the creation at the macro micro level, we can't understand it because the universe is intelligible. And the reason it's intelligible, it came from a mind that is um, orderly. Okay.
We've looked at scientific evidence. The universe had a beginning and is expanding. Evidence like the Big Bang, the BBG proof, and entropy. We also learned about the universe's fine-tuning and why fine-tuning makes it very unlikely that the universe happened by pure chance. Together, they show it's very likely the universe required a super-intelligent creator.
From last week, the two discussions that stood up in my mind was the Big Bang, which established that creation does have a beginning. And that was really fascinating that the galaxies we see, they're reddish because they're moving away from us. And also, I appreciated the fine tuning of the universe, that if just within the Earth in relationship to our place in the solar system and the moon and so forth, if the like for example the tilting of the Earth, if it was off, just a small percentage, we wouldn't have life as it is. So the fine tuning of the universe really speaks that it's that way intentionally because it comes from a God who has a mind. Okay.
But we can go further. There is another method we can use to prove that the universe actually required a creator. In this presentation, we're going to look at some philosophical proofs for God's existence.
But first, what is philosophy? Philosophy comes from the Greek, meaning the love of wisdom. It is a method used to arrive at truth by using logical reasoning. Here's a video to help explain what philosophy is for.
From a distance, philosophy seems weird, irrelevant, boring, and yet also just a little intriguing. But what are philosophers really for? The answer is handily already contained in the word philosophy itself. In ancient Greek, philo means love and sophia means wisdom. Philosophers are people devoted to wisdom. Being wise means attempting to live and die well. In their pursuit of wisdom, philosophers have developed a very specific skill set. They have, over the centuries, become experts in many of the things that make people not very wise. 5 stand out. There are lots of big questions around. What's the meaning of life? What's a job for? How should society be arranged? Most of us entertain them every now and then, but we despair of trying to answer them. They have the status almost of jokes. We call them pretentious. But they matter deeply because only with sound answers to them can we direct our energies meaningfully. Philosophers are people unafraid of asking big questions. They have, over the centuries, asked the very largest. They realize that these questions can always be broken down into more manageable chunks, and that the only really pretentious thing is to think one's above raising big, naive-sounding inquiries. Public opinion, or what gets called common sense, is sensible and reasonable in countless areas. It's what you hear about from friends and neighbors, the stuff you take in without even thinking about it. common sense is also often full of daftness and error. Philosophy gets us to submit all aspects of common sense to reason. It wants us to think for ourselves. Is it really true what people say about love, money, children, travel, work? Philosophers are interested in asking whether an idea is logical, rather than simply assuming it must be right because it's popular and long established. We're not very good at knowing what goes on in our own minds. Someone we meet is very annoying, but we can't pin down what the issue is. We lose our temper, but we can't readily tell what we're so cross about. We lack insights into our own satisfactions and dislikes. That's why we need to examine our own minds. Philosophy is committed to self-knowledge, and its central precept, articulated by the earliest, greatest philosopher, Socrates, is just 2 words long: know yourself. We're not very good at making ourselves happy. We overrate the power of some things to improve our lives and underrate others. We make the wrong choices because, guided by advertising and false glamour, we keep on imagining that a particular kind of holiday or car or computer will make a bigger difference than it can. At the same time, we underestimate the contribution of other things like going for a walk, which may have little prestige but can contribute deeply to the character of existence. Philosophers seek to be wise by getting more precise about the activities and attitudes that really can help our lives to go better. Philosophers are good at keeping a sense of what really matters and what doesn't. On hearing the news that he'd lost all his possessions in a shipwreck, the Stoic philosopher Zeno simply said, "Fortune commands me to be a less encumbered philosopher." It's responses like these that have made the very term philosophical a byword for calm, long-term thinking and strength of mind. In short, for perspective. The wisdom of philosophy is, in modern times, mostly delivered in the form of books. But in the past, philosophers sat in market squares and discussed their ideas with shopkeepers, or went into government offices and palaces to give advice. It wasn't abnormal to have a philosopher on your payroll. Philosophy was thought of as a normal, basic activity, rather than as an unusual, esoteric, optional extra. Nowadays, it's not so much that we overtly deny this thought, but we just don't have the right institutions set up to promulgate wisdom coherently in the world. In the future, though, when the value of philosophy is a little clearer, we can expect to meet more philosophers in daily life. They won't be locked up, living mainly in university departments, because the points at which our unwisdom bites and messes up our lives are multiple and urgently need attention right now.
So, what strikes you about philosophy? We can ask questions, basic questions, regarding the world. There's no logical necessity that the world exists. So we can ask ourselves, why is there a cosmos? Why is there a world? Then not. And who or what brought into being and why? The other thing about what philosophy does is something cannot, it's a law of contradictions. Something cannot be true and false at the same time. And so as we pursue the truth, if we have conflicting ideas, we can sort it out by saying what is the most compelling explanation. So I think philosophy is really a tool in seeking meaning and explaining the world we live in. In fact, when in terms of seminary training, seminarians were given, they studied philosophy first before they embarked on theology. The idea that philosophy kind of teaches them rigor and discipline before they engage in theological thought. Okay, let's see.
There was a famous medieval philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas, who believed that philosophy could tell us a lot about God. He used philosophy to develop 5 philosophical proofs of God's existence, proofs that are still used and studied today. In these proofs, Aquinas showed that there must be and can only be one uncreated, unlimited being who caused everything else. You're probably asking, what does that mean? Philosophical language can be tough to understand, so don't worry. We'll break it down in simpler language. We'll take it one step at a time and we'll use examples you're familiar with.
First, St. Thomas Aquinas said there must be at least one uncreated being. What does that mean? It means that there must be a being who was not created and who always existed. Here's an easier way to understand what Aquinas meant. Imagine you came across a chain, but you couldn't see all of it. Obviously, there has to be a beginning or a first link to a chain. If it went on forever, it would fill up the whole universe. St. Thomas Aquinas knew that everything created, including the universe, needs an uncreated being in order to exist, just like a chain has to have a first link. We'll explain why soon.
Here's another example. Think about setting up a line of dominoes to be knocked down. If set up correctly, each falling domino causes another domino to fall down. If there were unlimited dominoes, you'd have to set them up forever and you'd never get to knock them down. There has to be a first domino to knock the second one down. St. Thomas Aquinas said that there can't be unlimited causes. There has to be a first cause, an uncaused or uncreated cause, just like a first domino, in order for anything else to move.
So Aquinas's point is that an infinite regress doesn't really prove anything because the world has been actuated. It does exist. It has a beginning. If there was an infinite regress, we wouldn't have the world that we do have.
Now, logically, this first cause or first being couldn't be created. Why? Well, it couldn't be created by anything else because nothing else existed before it, and it couldn't create itself before it existed. So the only possible way this first being could exist is that it always existed. In other words, as Aquinas said, this first being is uncaused or uncreated because this is the first being. Everything else that exists came after it and was caused by it in some way. Nothing came before it.
That's a really salient point that the created order cannot come from nothing. What comes from nothing is nothing. And if you hearken back to the story of the burning bush episode, when God reveals himself to Moses, Moses asks, "Well, who are you? What is your name? Who shall I say sent me?" And he said, "I am who I am." That's not really a name in a proper sense, but basically it's saying, God is revealing himself. I simply am. God's existence is his essence.
Here's another example of the need for a first uncaused being who created everything else.
Okay, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
So far, we have a first being that is uncaused and always existed. St. Thomas Aquinas explained that the first being must also be unlimited.
So why would that be the case? Why would the first being, why would God need to be unlimited? Why does God need to be an unlimited being as opposed to a limited being?
Well, I believe if he was limited, then we would be limited. Creation would be limited. And I don't believe creation is limited.
How do you mean that?
Because, I mean, it's God created us, but there's more than just human beings, our planet, right? There's the universe.
Yeah.
So there's so much more. And I think because God's creating everything, because everything comes from that one being.
Mm-hmm.
it has to be limitless because I guess because of being unlimited would be infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's infinite possibilities
Mm-hmm.
of what God can do and create.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my understanding.
Okay.
This is Madeline. There's also this business that the universe is, as Cheryl was saying, it's infinite. And we know that throughout the years, the population of the earth has changed, right? And evaluated and got better. Some disappeared, some species disappeared, but it kept carrying on, right? So this is why it's limitless, because even if, let's say, we disappear, there would still be something carrying on, which of course we won't, but just in case.
If God was limited, that means there's something lacking in him, and there's things that he couldn't do. And so the universe, which is ever expanding, has no limit to its expansion. And now we know that there's billions of galaxies. That would really suggest that this cosmos, which has billions of galaxies, and each galaxy has billions of stars, how could that come from a limited being? Which would, suggest there's some kind of inadequacy, or there's some things that God couldn't do. If that was the case, how could he bring into existence through his word?
I can tell you something he can't do.
The what?
I can tell you something he can't do. He can't not be himself.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay, well, moving on
Can you think
here.
of anything in our universe that is unlimited? A book, for example, has many limits. It has a certain number of pages. It has a particular shape and size. It can only be in one place at a time. In fact, these limitations are what define it. They're what make it a book and not something else like a tree or a human. Even the universe itself has limits. It has a certain amount of matter and energy.
So the point here, I think, is that everything in space and time is limited by being a certain geographical location in a certain moment of time. If you're in Sacramento, you can't at the next moment be in New York City. And so throughout the whole cosmos, there's limitations. So the cosmos has limitations at the micro, macro level, but the source of creation is not limited, but is unlimited.
There's one other thing to know about an unlimited being. It has to be perfectly simple. Why? Because anything made up of parts is going to be limited. If something has more than one part, those parts have to be different from each other. And those differences are defined by the part's limitations, just like a book is defined by its limitations. The limits of each part of a thing cause the whole thing to be limited.
The implication of that regarding the Trinity, sometimes when I would be teaching to my students and talking about the Trinity, and they would use language, well, God has three parts. And I discourage that kind of language, because if God has parts, that means that God can be separated and divided, and God is one. Uh, and so the genius or the revelation of the church in trying to explain the Trinity is that God is simple. It's not three parts, but it's three persons sharing one divine nature. And, that speaks to the simplicity of God. God is three in one.
So for a being like God to be unlimited means it can't be made up of parts. It must be perfectly simple.
The third thing Aquinas said was this: there can only be one uncreated, unlimited being. Why? Because things are defined by their differences. Two completely identical things are impossible.
I guess the closest thing to that would be identical twins, but they do have their unique psychological histories in which they would be distinct. I don't- Can anybody think of something two completely identical things? Okay, we shall see.
Even when things appear to be identical, there is always something different about them, or they would be the same thing. Sometimes what makes two things different is just the fact that they can't be in the same place at the same time. So there can't be two unlimited beings. If there were, they would both be everywhere at all times and would be the same being. There can only be one uncreated, unlimited being.
Finally, St. Thomas Aquinas said that this one uncreated, unlimited being must be the ultimate cause of everything else that exists. Only the first being could create the second being.
Or third being, or fourth being, and so forth.
However, the third being came to exist, whether from the first being or from the second being, its existence would still ultimately be dependent on the first being. By this point, we can call this one uncreated, unlimited being who must be the ultimate cause of everything else that exists, God, because its characteristics are consistent with the way God is described in the Bible.
Yeah, that quote at the bottom, all things came to be through him, without him nothing came to be, from John 1:3.
Two questions are often asked to challenge St. Thomas Aquinas' proof of God's existence. The first is, who created God? And the second is, why can't the universe be the ultimate cause of everything?
So the second point, it was what Bertrand Russell's notion is the universe simply is. It's the cause of its own existence, I suppose.
Both these questions are handled in the very first step of Aquinas' proof. We saw that there has to be a first being who always existed and caused everything else. Earlier, we showed that the universe had a beginning and itself needed to be created, so it couldn't be the ultimate cause of everything.
Here's an explanation.
Frank, one objection we hear from time to time is when we talk about this idea that, we believe that this universe that we live in was created, then people will say, well, then who created God?
Yeah, that's a great question. It turns out to be a bad question because if you think about it long enough, if God is uncreated, then he didn't have a beginning. Look, there has to be an uncaused first cause. There's two possibilities. Either the universe is the uncaused first cause, or something that is beyond the universe is the uncaused first cause. And all the evidence shows, both the philosophical and scientific evidence, shows that space, matter, and time had a beginning. In other words, the universe had a cause. It had a beginning, so it must have had a cause, which means whatever's outside the universe must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, must be that first cause. Now, if you're timeless, do you have a cause? No, you're eternal. So whatever created the universe is the uncaused first cause. It didn't have a beginning. You know, it amazes me too, Bobby, that a lot of atheists have a lot of trouble believing in an eternal God. Yet for centuries, they believed in an eternal universe, and they had no problem believing in an eternal universe. But somehow, when an eternal God comes up, they go, oh, that can't be. No, the evidence points to the fact that it can be. In fact, there has to be something that's eternal. Even Aristotle knew this. There has to be an unmoved mover.
That was a very succinct argument. Um, I appreciate what he said, that in our universe, it's in a space-time material continuum. And therefore, the cause of the universe must be outside of space, outside of time, and be immaterial or spiritual. And that's what we call God. Also, I thought his point was well taken, is that atheists have a problem with the idea of an eternal God, but seem comfortable with the idea of an eternal universe.
Recently, scientist Richard Dawkins brought up another objection to St. Thomas Aquinas' proof for God's existence. He said God would be more complex than what he creates. Then he said a complex creator is unlikely. Remember Occam's razor, the simplest answer is usually correct. According to Dawkins, that means God is unlikely. Does his objection make sense? Well, there's a problem with the first part of Dawkins' objection, where he says that God would be more complex than what he creates. We just saw in the second step of St. Thomas Aquinas' proof, an unlimited God can't be made of limited parts. So instead of being more complex, God actually must be perfectly simple. Since the first part of Dawkins' argument is flawed, it can't support his conclusion. Without realizing it, Dawkins has actually shown that God, the simplest explanation, is the most likely cause of everything else that exists.
So this reflection that using the principle Occam's razor, God is simple. He's one. He's not many. And that if he had parts, um, that that would suggest that he's incomplete. And if he has parts, it can be divided and separated. And it raised the question, if God could be separated, then you have multiplicity of gods. And what caused God, so to speak. So this reasoning leads us to that God is simple, God is one, his existence is his essence, and he can't be divided.
Even though these philosophical proofs can tell us a lot about God, they can't tell us everything about him. We can know that there's one unlimited God who always existed and who created everything else. But philosophy leaves many questions about God unanswered. Like, is God aware of us? Does God care about us? Does God answer our prayers? Does God forgive us?
And this leads us to where philosophy and science can tell us that God exists, that he is the uncaused cause. Philosophy really can't address these questions. Is God aware of us? Does God care about us? And so forth. And that's why we need revelation, scripture, that God is going to reveal to us what we need for our salvation, to be in relationship with God, that our reason can take us so far, but can't address these questions.
For us to really know God, not just know that he exists, God had to reveal himself to us. We could never know that God is like the father of the prodigal son by thinking about an uncaused being or by observing the redshift of galaxies, could we? He had to tell us.
Let's watch this explanation of why God revealed himself to us.
Why does God reveal himself? All right, man is a being with the powers of reason and will. The meaning of his life is to know truth and to love the good. If a man turns to the pursuit of the highest truth and the highest good, then he enters upon the path of religion. Now, since God is infinitely greater than our intellect, our own searching and striving for God may seem rather pathetic. And it would have to remain rather pathetic if God did not stoop down and come to meet us, if God did not reveal himself. The belief that God reveals himself is at the core of the Jewish and Christian faith. But here a question comes up. Why should God even stoop down? Why should he reveal himself? God is happy in himself. He does not need the world. The Christian answer to this question can be found in the first letter of John. There it is written, God is love. Not only does this sound really nice, it is also very helpful in understanding Revelation. For this, let us consider human love, which we're familiar with. When we experience something beautiful, something wonderful,
we have the desire to share it with those we love. For instance, if we are gazing at a panoramic view of the mountains and watching a sunset as a flock of geese crosses the sky in perfect formation, we wish that our loved ones were here with us to share in the moment. Love desires the good of the other. Love wants the other to share in its own happiness. So, if God is love, then we can understand the meaning of creation and revelation. God does not need the world. He does not depend on it. But God desires to create for the simple reason that creation may share in his glory. Bonum diffusium sui, says St. Thomas Aquinas with Dionysius. The good is diffusive of itself. So God created the world and revealed himself to it because he is love. He desires man to share in his divine life, the highest truth and the highest good. This is only possible through revelation, since man can only love what he knows.
Any thoughts on that video? That line from first letter of John explains so much. God is love. And since God doesn't need anything from us, doesn't need anything from the world, why did he create? Well, since he is love, he brought everything into being so that we could participate in his goodness. That's what love does. And that explains the expansiveness of the cosmos, that since God's love is infinite, when he brings everything into being, there's going to be no limit once it gets going. There's no outer boundary to creation. And that same love explains why the word became flesh. He loves us so much that he became one of us for our salvation. So that one 3 words statement of John's gospel explains so much, that God is love. And at heart, it speaks to his simplicity. God's not divided. He simply is love. Yeah.
The answers to the video's questions are related. First, God reveals himself to us because he is perfect love. And what he reveals is that he wants to share his life with us.
And that speaks to our first module, the existence of a soul. And the reason we have a soul, reflective consciousness and a will, is that we could intentionally share in his life. That he has created us in his image so that we could participate in his very being. It's like at Holy Mass, when the priest or deacon pours the water, a little bit of water into the wine, that it's just as may we participate in your divinity as you have shared in our humanity. It's that same principle.
In a way, we're just like God. We also love and want to share our lives with others. Even though we aren't perfect, like God, we still want our relationships with the people we love to be perfect, don't we? We all desire perfect love, and we have other perfect desires too. The ancient Greek philosophers of Plato and Aristotle realized we also want perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect truth, and a perfect home with a perfect being.
The point here, I think, is even though we may never experience perfect justice or beauty and truth and so forth, we desire, for these values. And the desire points to these can be obtained, and eventually they're obtained in God.
Isn't it true when we think we've experienced something perfect, we still wonder if there could be something even better? We eventually get tired or frustrated with everything we experience in this world. This got C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, to wonder, why do we desire perfection, even though we've never experienced it? Some people answer Lewis by saying, we evolved that way. But Lewis replied, That's not how evolution works. Evolution says we adapt to our environment, but there's nothing perfect in our environment to adapt to. How can we evolve to desire something that doesn't exist? There's got to be a better answer.
Let's see what that answer might be.
Certain desires everyone has in common, like the desire for food, drink, sex, sleep, beauty, knowledge, and friendship. Now, thankfully, each of these desires has a corresponding object. And there's food for the hungry, there's water for the thirsty, sleep when we're tired, and so on. But there are also what I'm going to call unquenchable desires. Desires that don't have a corresponding object or that don't seem to have a corresponding object. As C.S. Lewis once said, if I find in myself a desire for an experience which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Now, this is a powerful clue to God's existence, because God seems to be the corresponding object for our unquenchable desire. Now, for anyone who says that they're completely satisfied, all I can say is that the collected testimony of the human race is against them. No amount of success or earthly fulfillment has ever appeased a person entirely. Now, in fact, Mick Jagger, who certainly has enjoyed his share of earthly success and acquired more than most people can imagine, he's the one who screams loudly, I can't get no satisfaction. None of us can. Not fully. Is there something, or better yet, someone who can give us ultimate satisfaction? Someone wholly other to ourselves? Now, at this point, maybe you'll object again and you'll say, maybe we have this unquenchable desire. Maybe we're perpetually unfulfilled in the ultimate sense, but that doesn't mean that God is real. That's a huge leap to go from an unquenchable desire all the way to God. And I would say to you that this unquenchable desire, if it's unfulfilled, it's unprecedented. What do I mean by that? Well, in the list of natural desires that I've given you, this would be the only one that doesn't have a corresponding object. Does that mean it's true necessarily? Not necessarily, but it ought to give us pause for thought. Why is it that in the list of these natural and innate desires, this is the only one that doesn't have a corresponding object? I think this merits further thought. Consider whether Christianity is true, because if it is true, it would say that this ultimate desire in you is not mocking you. It actually is a powerful clue about the nature of reality itself and about nothing less than God's existence.
Well, any remarks on this? We have these natural desires. We can satisfy desire for food, for drink, for sex, and so forth. But we also have desires for perfect justice, for perfect beauty, for happiness. And his point is all the natural desires have a corresponding object that can be satisfied. And so we have this desire for perfect justice, for example, and there's no object to that for perfect justice. And that's kind of seems to be begging the question. Why would the desire for perfect justice and beauty and joy and so forth, why would it not have a correspondent object? And it's not a logical necessity, but it does point to the existence of God. God is perfect justice. He's the source of our happiness. He's perfect beauty and goodness. I don't know. It's a very simple argument. I find it very persuasive.
C.S. Lewis said, if I find in myself a desire for an experience which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world.
So our time here on earth, it's like we're staying at a a hotel, Motel 6. This is not our permanent home. We really are made for another world. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this desire for perfect happiness and perfect joy and justice and beauty and goodness. So, do you think we're made for another world? The fact that we desire perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect goodness, that can't be satisfied here on earth completely, that means that we are made for another world. What do you think about that? St. Augustine put it this way, our hearts were made for thee, and they'll be forever restless until they rest in thee. So we come from God. We're meant to return to God. We're meant to be with God. And we won't be completely at one with God here on this earth, but we will be at one with God in another world. We call that heaven. So it's really important to listen to what we desire. I mean, it's kind of offbeat, but in the movie The Silence of the Lamb, when Hannibal Lecter says to Clarice, Clarice, what is it that you desire? It's really important to look at our desires because they're there for a reason.
According to Lewis, the desire for perfection that couldn't have evolved. But we live in an imperfect world, so there must be another world with a perfect being who can satisfy our desire for perfection. Who might that be? That's right. Our desire for perfection is really a desire for God.
We've looked at philosophical proof and scientific evidence for God's existence, but other questions can come up about the existence of God. For starters, can God's existence be disproven? This often comes up in the context of science. Atheists often say that science has disproven God, but has it? What would be involved in disproving God's existence?
Actually, it's much easier to prove something exists than that it doesn't. To prove something exists, we only need to find one of them. To disprove something, we need to rule out that it exists anywhere in the universe. For example, we could prove aliens exist if we found just one, but to disprove they exist, we'd have to be everywhere in the universe at the same time. And how would we even know we had every possible means of detecting them? The best an honest scientist can say is we have no evidence whether or not aliens exist. So what about God? If science can't even disprove the existence of aliens who would be in our universe, how could science disprove God who would be outside of our universe?
Yeah, that's a good point. God who exists outside of the universe, how could you prove that he doesn't exist? I mean, what would that look
In
like?
fact, just as science can't disprove God's existence, it also can't prove scientifically that he does exist. Science doesn't have the tools. It's limited to exploring the physical universe. But God is not physical. He's a spiritual being. So there can be no absolute scientific proof that God exists.
So that doesn't negate last week's module that science can really point to the existence of God, but it doesn't absolutely prove that God exists. But since God is a spiritual being, you can't use physical tools to explain a spiritual being. There are two different planes.
So Deacon Jim, even if like with miracles that occur, like, when the host, turns into, when blood comes from the host, even that it's still just, it's science, but it's not considered like
Outside of the universe.
complete proof.
Yeah, I was trying. I got distracted by that we were doing a slide. Can you run that again, please, Teresa? So you're talking about the Eucharist?
Right, like when the host, the miracles, the
Yeah.
times when the host has bled, or
Yeah, yeah.
so does that still relate to science adding kind of more checks in the column where God would exist, but it's not definitive proof. They still don't consider that definitive proof.
Well, I think with the Eucharistic miracles, science would say they can't explain it. And because, science exists within space and time, it uses physical explanations to explain how things interact. And the Eucharistic miracle is on the spiritual plane. And so the world of physics or materiality cannot explain the spiritual. Now, the spiritual can explain what's going on at the empirical level. So the higher can integrate the lower, but the lower can't integrate the higher. So science would never be able to explain those phenomena because now we're going to a spiritual domain. So then when you have these so many examples, it's, for someone of faith, they say, well, okay, the best explanation for the Eucharistic miracle is that's God at work. There's no physical explanation for that. Okay.
In fact, just as science can't disprove God's existence, it also can't prove scientifically that he does exist. Science doesn't have the tools. It's limited to exploring the physical universe. But God is not physical. He's a spiritual being. So there can be no absolute scientific proof that God exists. However, as we've seen, there's much scientific evidence that strongly suggests he does. The Big Bang is evidence the universe is expanding. The BVG proof and entropy are evidence the universe had a beginning. And the fine-tuning of the universe for life is evidence the universe very likely requires an intelligent creator. Even though the scientific evidence is not absolute proof that God exists, it gives us many good reasons to believe that he does.
Proof that God exists, as we've just seen, comes from philosophy. St. Thomas Aquinas proved that there has to be one uncreated, unlimited being who created everything else. And C.S. Lewis supported Aquinas' proof by showing that it's very likely our desire for perfection also comes from God.
Some people are agnostics, which means they are unsure whether or not God exists. They aren't atheists because they don't believe God has been disproven, and they aren't believers or theists either because they don't believe he has been proven. They may not know about the evidence, or they may know about it but not find it convincing. I did there.
Let's see what Richard Dawkins says about being an agnostic.
Very kind. Thank you very much. There are many people who call themselves agnostic, and I want to clarify this. It's rather a confusing term. I put up here a scale of religiosity from 1 to 7, where 1 is, I know there is a God, and 7 is, I know there is no God, and we've got a scale of intermediate agnostic positions in between. 4 is exactly 50%. Number 4, agnostic, believes that the probability of God existing and not existing is exactly equal. Number 2 is, I don't exactly know there's a God, but I have a very high probability. I believe in a very high probability of there being a God. I'm a de facto theist. I can't know for certain, but I strongly believe in God and live my life on the assumption that he's there. A number 6, at the other end, is somebody who believes there's a very low probability of God existing, but still not quite 0. I'm a de facto atheist. I can't know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he isn't there. I'm a number 6. I'm an agnostic, but with the same level of belief in God as I have belief in fairies or unicorns.
If there's so much evidence for God, why do we need faith? Reason is limited in what it can tell us about God. Someone can follow the philosophical proofs to conclude that God exists, but just knowing God exists is not enough. Many agnostics who have studied the evidence and proofs become deists, which means they know God exists, but incorrectly think he doesn't care about them. God, however, wants more than us just knowing he exists. He wants a loving relationship with us. God offers his love freely, but it's our choice whether or not to accept his offer. To have this relationship with God, just like any relationship of love, we need to take a leap of faith by accepting that his love is true and trusting him with our lives.
Are you ready to take this leap of faith? Here's what it's like.
Reasons other than the lack of scientific proof do people give for being atheists? First, many people are troubled by the question of why an all-loving, all-powerful God would allow so much suffering when he could prevent it or stop it. Christianity charts a path to find positive meaning in suffering, which we'll discuss later in its own presentation. But if someone doesn't encounter this deeper meaning, they can often conclude that suffering means God doesn't love us, and so they reject God out of sadness or resentment. Second, some don't want to be answerable to any higher authority, including God, and this feeling leads them to avoid even considering the possibility of his existence or any evidence.
I think that's particularly true in Western society with our penchant for individualism and autonomy and freedom being understood in terms of free from external constraints. And the idea of surrendering to another being, another person, is really contrary to a kind of an individualistic ethic. But that's the basic choice that we have. Our life is either about God or it's about ourselves. And if it's about God, then we, surrender to him, which is contained in the, the second petition of the Our Father, that thy will be done.
Third, some think faith is just wishful thinking. They don't see a reasonable source of faith, so they decide that atheism is more honest than taking a blind leap of faith. A fourth reason given for atheism is that some, like Karl Marx, say that religion discourages the poor from fighting injustice because it distracts them with the promise of a better life after death. On the other hand, Christianity has actually been central to many advances in social justice, like the development of hospitals, orphanages, and schools. Finally, children are sometimes falsely introduced to God as harsh, demanding, and even hateful. Sadly, this trauma can stay with them their whole lives, leading them to avoid God and religion altogether. They may never get a chance to discover God as the loving and forgiving Father of the prodigal son.
Are science and the Bible in conflict? We've looked at scientific evidence for God's existence, but it's common today to assume that science and faith disagree, and especially that science and the Bible are in conflict.
So let's embark on the discussion that the Genesis account of creation, it's not a scientific account, um, uh, but it does contain truths. It contains religious truths about who God is and who we are and the goodness of creation and so forth.
The most common example is the age of the universe. Some think the Bible says it is less than 10,000 years old, while science says the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. So do they disagree? In 1943, Pope Pius XII explained that science and the Bible are different kinds of sources for understanding creation. The Bible reveals sacred truths necessary for salvation, so its focus is on explaining that God created the world, that creation was good, and that human beings were created in God's image and likeness.
So the Genesis creation story is not a scientific account of how the world was brought into being, but it does contain really important religious truths, such as God created the world, it's not self-created, creation was good, and that we're made in the image and likeness of God.
Science is concerned with collecting information to describe the physical condition of the early universe. We shouldn't get these sources confused and look to the Bible as the source for scientific data, nor to science as a source for the sacred truths of salvation. Ultimately, the truths revealed in the Bible and that science has discovered can't be in conflict because they both come from one source, the infinite mind and all-loving heart of God.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point that since God is truth itself, then science and faith can never be at odds. Scientific truth cannot disprove religious truth, and vice versa, since all truth comes from God.
Even though Genesis is not a scientific account of what happened at creation, it reveals that everything in the universe was created by the one God and is good, especially humans who are created in his image. There are some interesting similarities between the Bible's creation story and the Big Bang, like the creation of light before the stars. But this was not God's main purpose for the Bible. Over the years, the Catholic Church has a long history of involvement in scientific development, including the contributions of Copernicus, Galileo, Louis Pasteur, Gregor Mendel, Father George Lemaitre, and many others. Galileo's case is often cited as proof the Catholic Church is against scientific progress. But that was really more of a political conflict between Galileo and the Pope over how much proof Galileo needed before he published his findings.
Another topic where science and faith are often thought to conflict is evolution. Recently, 2 popes have spoken about evolution. In 1950, Pope Pius XII explained that Catholics must believe 2 things about creation. First, that God directly creates a soul in every human being, and second, that souls are not physical or biological structures that evolve. If these 2 truths are maintained, Catholics are free to consider evolution as a scientific account. Then in 1996, Pope St. John Paul II gave a similar statement. He noted that there is evidence for evolution, and he also cautioned that any theory of evolution that says souls are physical goes against what Scripture teaches. We must maintain the revealed truth that God directly creates each soul.
Let's watch a video explaining the Catholic view of evolution.
Many Catholics are actually somewhat confused about evolution. And when I sort of asked in a non-scientific sampling, most Catholics think, well, the church has no problem with evolution. I remember something that Pope John Paul said in the 1990s, and that's really enough for them. More sort of careful studying type people realize that there's some kind of problem, but they often don't actually know what the church's official position is. If you read the official literature, though, you read Pope Pius XII's encyclical from 1950, for instance, and theological commissions that have talked about evolution, it's clear that from the beginning, the church has had serious concerns about Darwinian evolution, and that's the important distinction. We can't just talk about evolution vaguely, as if we're talking about the age of the universe or change over time. It's the specifically Darwinian claim of random genetic mutations and natural selection. So a purposeless and unguided process, as it's normally defined. That's always been a problem for the church. And in fact, the church explicitly says that's not the sort of thing we can believe. Catholics are free to entertain certainly various hypotheses about evolution, cosmic evolution, the idea that organisms share a common ancestor. But there's key Catholic claims that contradict with any kind of materialistic theory of evolution. First of all, that God had a specific plan and purpose in mind, not just for us, but for everyone. That God in some way specially acted in the creation of Adam and Eve, that all human beings are the descendants of Adam and Eve, who themselves freely sinned and fell from an original innocent state. Those are key Catholic doctrines. And any theory of evolution that contradicts that is going to be a theory of evolution that's contrary to the Catholic faith. That's what the church teaches. It's unfortunate that people don't know that more widely. But if you really study the issue, the church's counsel is actually quite clear.
Catholics are also free to consider the existence of aliens. While no evidence exists for life outside of Earth, the number of galaxies and stars suggests that there may be planets where life could exist. If intelligent aliens were created, we can assume that they would have souls and that God would want loving relationships with them and offer them salvation.
Lord, guide us in our understanding as we study these questions and this philosophical proof. Give us the courage to share what it reveals about you with others so that your kingdom may grow on earth as it already is in heaven. Amen.
And here are some resources. Okay. Any, before we go, depart, any thoughts or questions or add-ons to what you saw?
Yes.
I thought they did a good job of explaining the relationship between reason and faith. And as St. Paul says, we love God even though we don't see God. But it's not like a pipe dream. I hope God is out there. I hope that he cares for me. That because we have a soul, we can experience God, intimately every day, especially in the Eucharist when God comes into our bodies. So, it's, I thought this was, pretty compelling to show that, faith and reason are not at odds, that faith can really assist us in our faith, in our relationship with God. Okay. Well, next week is my favorite one. It's on the historicity of Jesus and proof of the resurrection, focusing on the Shroud of Turin. And I know some of you have some background on the Shroud, and it is absolutely fascinating. It may not, the Shroud of Turin, I think it can be an occasion, a launching pad for faith. Certainly it can kind of confirm faith. But I see the Shroud, especially how it survived for 2 millennium. I see it as a gift from God to us. And so I'm really looking forward to, sharing this with you. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you, Teresa, for, facilitating this. And we'll see you next Monday.